So starting with, generally speaking, we only have either acceptable or high external validity, or the external validity is unknown. If you were being technical and you said something was of low external validity, what we're saying here is that the sample and the results from the study that used said sample do not accurately generalize to the population. And that too requires some way of knowing. And so for the most part, when we're evaluating external validity, it either is high because of how the sample was derived, or it is ultimately unknown. Now, it should also be noted that having an unknown external validity is not necessarily the end of the world. Even actually having a demonstrated low external validity is also not the end of the world, but rather this implies that more work needs to be done because there are other contextual factors that seem to be influencing the type of results that we would like to be seeing, or the claims we would like to make from those results. Another thing that is important to note is that whenever external validity is ultimately unknown, researchers should be careful or moderate in their claims because it is unknown how widely they can be generalized. This is something that, for example, should be considered in much psychological literature that's done on psychology students to ensure that the results and what claims one is making is not impacted by the fact that this subset of the population might or might not be different than the larger population. So for the three claims in external validity, all three of the claims or the studies that are making these types of claims can benefit from having high external validity because it just allows us to generalize those more broadly. But it is, for the most part, considered most important for frequency claims. And that is because frequency claims tend to be focused largely on what is the rate of some phenomena or metric of interest in the population at large, or the population of interest more specifically. And it is almost always using a sample of some kind to make these claims. So if a sample has unknown external validity, we don't know if it will generalize or not. And so any claims we make about the population of interest are maybe not unfounded, but not resting on very strong foundations. Further, if a sample could be shown to have low external validity, this would dramatically compromise the end results of a frequency claim that is trying to generalize to the population. If you don't care about generalizing to a larger population and you're only interested in information about your sample, this matters much less. Now, the reason this doesn't matter as much, or external validity is not generally such a high priority for people who are working on associations and causal claims, is just because here the claims are not always either focused on the general populations, or they are making claims about things that are unlikely to be affected by different individuals within the population itself. For example, a lot of cognitive psychology studies visual processing in the brain, and the way in which basic visual processing takes place in the human brain is pretty much the same for all human beings, barring lesions or neurological disorders of some kind. But all other people process visual input, in functionally speaking, the same way. And it doesn't matter what your gender is, or where you come from, or when you were born, or really any of those types of things, on how that process works. And so one doesn't really need to be very focused on having a truly representative sample in those cases. There are, however, situations in which even these types of claims should be tempered if external validity is not maintained. When it comes to testing external validity, or evaluating whether it is high or low in an empirical sense, this is actually quite difficult to do. So the two things that could be done, hypothetically, though you'll not often see this, except maybe the first one in cross-cultural psychology, and that would be to run a series or set of confirmatory studies. And what that would indicate is you run one study, you have some information, and then you run the same study in multiple different situations or with multiple different biased samples to ensure that the results ultimately generalize or match up in all of these different contexts. If you could do this with enough situations, it would be possible to make claims for actual high external validity. Though note that there will always be places you have not tested, and so you will always be open to that critique. The other way that this could be done or resolved would be to conduct a census where you had information on every single individual in the population of interest, but that would ultimately negate the need to have a study where you were interested in external validity or not, because you would now have access to information about every single individual, and you're no longer concerned about generalizing, because what would you generalize to if you knew about everyone? This is why external validity is pretty much always evaluated considering the methodology that was used to obtain a sample and run the study, and not really in some empirical way that we can sometimes test some of the other validities, like construct validity and using different correlations to evaluate things like reliability. Now, as I kind of mentioned before, having an unknown external validity is not always a problem. And even though for frequency claims it is largely more important than for the other types of claims, having an unknown external validity, even in a frequency claim, is not always a deal breaker or something that will just negate all of the work that was done. And really what determines this is the bias sample systematically different from the population of interest in a particular way that is likely to influence the results that are coming out of the study, and then how those results will be used to make claims. So an example to sort of clarify this would be, imagine if you were using an online survey or poll that required self-selection for people to select into. Now, this would ultimately result in a biased sample because not everybody has the type of personality where they would like to self-select into one of these surveys and ultimately make their responses. So if I was asking people to indicate how extroverted these people were, or maybe how outgoing they were, this could be potentially problematic, because people who self-select or have sort of the confidence to go in and say or declare their opinions in such a forum, whereas others might not, this might be something that results in differences of extroversion across people who do self-select into things versus people who do not. Because perhaps people who do not self-select into this are slightly more either shy or introverted, let's say. So for something like that, it could be problematic. Asking about how much people like pizza probably doesn't matter so much, because chances are introverted and extroverted people on average like pizza about the same amount. Now, it can become somewhat tricky occasionally, because if you consider Japanese food, for example, which is stereotypically considered to be an adventurous food by non-Japanese individuals, so here now you get into a little bit of a mixture. Do people who self-select into such surveys tend to be slightly more extroverted and adventurous? And if so, that could result in biased representation in people responding to whether or not they like Japanese food. But it could also be that that's not really something that impacts it very much. But without actual testing or effective obtaining of samples in this probabilistic manner that we talked about in the previous set of slides, it is difficult to really know. And because it's so hard to know, we generally ultimately use this random notion of obtaining samples so that we can at least assume that it matches well in qualities and traits to the population of interest. Now, finally, one thing that comes up quite a bit actually is that this idea that larger samples are better, and in some cases, yes, they are, but larger samples has no bearing on external validity. So one gets this sort of bias or heuristic a lot from intro method and stats classes, because you're constantly bombarded with this notion that you cannot have samples that are too small, make sure to get larger samples. But that is a matter of statistical validity, not external validity, which is all about generalizing. So for example, if I wanted to evaluate how pet owners feel, it wouldn't really make a difference to my claims if I had 100 dog owners or 10 million dog owners and no cat and turtle owners, because ultimately I'm only looking at one subset of pet owners. And so no matter how many I have in there, my ultimate claims about pet owners in general will always be biased, and just adding more and more of one kind will not really help resolve that issue. Something that larger samples do impact is called the margin of error. Margin of error is a statistic based in part on sample size, and it indicates the probable true value of a percentage estimate or point estimate in a population. The most common or places you'll see this are either in standard error, which is the divisor oftentimes of any kind of t-test or group comparison, or presented as confidence intervals. Both of these are indexes of how much error can we assume is present in a certain type of measurement, and then the inferences that are based on that measurement. Now, when it comes to general rules about what counts as a sufficiently large sample, you will find that this varies incredibly widely. Everywhere from having more than 30 or 40 individuals in a cognitive psych experiment to having 2,000 individuals in a political poll. Now, it should be noted that increasing your sample size, while it will always reduce the margin of error till the point where you have every single individual included, it follows a law of diminishing returns. What this means is that the amount that you gain in reduction of your margin of error for adding 100 additional people will be more than it will be for the next set of 100 people that you add, and even then it will just continue to degrade or lessen as you add more and more individuals. So you get the biggest bang for your buck, or it would be a way to say it, when you increase a small sample to a slightly larger sample, as opposed to taking an already large sample and just making it even larger. Now, instead of getting caught up in general rules about what you should just apply to everything, because single rules rarely work for the entirety of the world and all the contexts present within it, we actually have a statistical system for evaluating what the appropriate sample size would be given our previous knowledge about a domain. And this falls under what is called power analysis. Now, you don't have to get into the complex math of how this works. There are many, many tools that exist both online and downloadable or through stats programs that will allow you to take previous information of I expect these types of differences and stuff like that to evaluate how many individuals you need per group or set in your studies to adequately see those types of effects at the probability estimates that we generally use. So when in doubt with unknown sample sizes, it is best to use a power analysis of some kind.